Adriana Turpin studied history at Oxford and then history of art at the Courtauld Institute. She was the academic director of the 2 master's programs on the history and business of art and collecting, run by the IESA School of Art and Culture in Paris, validated by the University of Warwick, and remains there as a consultant and teacher. As a furniture specialist, she teaches on English furniture and on collecting furniture, and is the FHS project manager for the British and Irish Furniture Makers online database. She is a founder member of the Seminar on Display and Collecting at the Institute of Historical Research, University of London, and is the co-editor of their publications. She is the chairman of the Society for the History of Collecting, based in London. Adriana is also on the editorial board of the Brill publication series on art markets and collecting and the Journal of the History of Collections. Adriana has written on a variety of topics related to collecting and to the history of furniture.
We can go through that. We don't have to do all of that.
I will just do 3 of the most recent articles. So Walpole and the creation of a market in Britain for ebony furniture from the East, in researching art markets, past, present, and tools for the future, which he also co-edited. Collecting French furniture in the 19th century, appropriation as a form of nationalism in art crossing borders, the internationalization of the art market in the age of nation states, 1750-1914, edited by Jan Dirk Batens and Dries Lina, on the value of collecting practices in early modern Europe in locating and dislocating value, a pragmatic approach to early modern and 19th century economic practices, edited by Berg de Munck and Dries Lina. So, Adriana, the floor is yours.
Well, I'm very aware I'm the only thing keeping you from your drinks, so I will try to be precise and concise. But I have a topic which, as Tina says, I've been working on for a while, and it's wonderful to be here and share with you, and already I can see some of the interesting discussions happening as we all learn from each other. So thank you very much for the invitation to be here. Is that okay, or is there a terrible resonance? Is that okay? If it does at the back, something, just raise your hand and I will try and lower my voice. Okay, so transfer, translation, and appropriate of French 18th century furniture primarily, because that's my specialty. And we're not going to be looking at paintings. We are going to be looking at furniture and furnishings. And these 2 slides, one from the early 19th century showing the corridors at Windsor Castle with the collections of the furniture by André Charles Boulle, the great French 17th, 18th century furniture maker. There, I knew I would do it wrong. There is I'm going the wrong way. Right, there we go. And that's the pointer, just to show you the Boulle furniture in case you couldn't see it. A great armoire and cabinet, the sort of magnificent furniture that we're going to be looking at in more detail. And then on the other screen, from the end of the century, the ballroom at the Grosvenor House in London, Grosvenor Square, again with French 18th century furniture, completely furnished top to toe, and in an interior, again, a 19th century interior, complete revival of the old French style, as it was called at the time, or sometimes tous les Louis, and you'll see why as we go into it. So British interiors were often a mix of all the 18th century styles combined. The main point was grandeur, luxury, ostentation, and as much gold as you could pile into a room. In the same vein, while the arrival of works from France offered an unprecedented opportunity to buy genuine antiques, these were often combined with new pieces. They might be copies, they might be modern pieces created in an eclectic mix of old and new tastes. Thus, the transfer of the aristocratic style of one country, France, and one period, the Ancien Regime of the 18th century, was transferred to Britain and to British society of the 19th century, and then appropriated by the new consumers and reconfigured into a new modern style. In a subject of such breadth, I think the most fruitful approach for me is really just to take up a few themes, and those of the conference are perfect. So we are going to look first at transfer, then translation, and then appropriation, although they do interact with each other. And I think this idea of the movement of objects from one place to another, the new context in which they are set, the new meanings that they are given in their new context, is particularly interesting at this time as we see works, these literally becoming new objects and representing new ideas, to collectors who also intersect and exchange in a network of dealers, collectors, and agents. Altering furniture, which often reflects the predilections and preferences of the collector, buying and selling in a constant sort of movement of 19th century art market. So I'm going to start with who collected. We'll see if we go to them. So there we have some of the aristocratic, and not entirely only aristocratic figures who were buying at the beginning of the 19th century, starting with, of course, George IV, who really was one of the people who instigated this style, and then moving on to other figures who were, again, of his contemporaries, like William Beckford, or here this man with this wonderful name, Poole Tilney Long Wellesley, the nephew of the Duke of Wellington. Lord Gwydir at Grimthorpe Castle, I couldn't get a picture of him, so you get his castle. And then moving into the second half of the 19th century, because this continues all the way through the century, we just have representation of two of the greatest collectors, Francis Seymour Conway, whose collection, of course, is now at the Wallace Collection, and Walter Francis Montague Douglas Scott, the 5th Duke of Buccleuch, and again, collections which still survive in his 3 homes in Scotland and England. So the movement of figures, I forgot, of course, the very dashing Marquis of Buckingham, Chandos. Again, a person who I think you almost get a feeling as you see these people, why their collection, some of them disappeared. They're very ebullient, and I think they spent huge amounts of money. So Poole lost his collection only a few years after creating it in 1823. There was the sale of Wanstead, Stowe sale of 1848, other sales as well of collectors. It was a very, I think, show-off time, the Regency. So where does it start? Well, of course, it starts and could not have happened, this phenomenon, without the French Revolution and the sale of revolutionary works of art. There on the left, you have one page of an announcement of the daily sales held in the courtyard at Versailles in 1793, selling off the French royal collections. And of course, it wasn't just the royal collections. There are references also to sales in the 1790s from the Choiseul-Praslin and other aristocratic families. And there's a lot we don't even know about, which somehow were sold in Hamburg or they were smuggled out, because of course the revolutionary government needed money and hard cash, and selling art was a way to get hard cash. So these sales took place in Paris, but we also think they somehow took place outside Paris. And as far as we know, it was the dealers in Paris and even the makers themselves. So we know that Riesner actually attended some of the sales and bought back some of his furniture. So as far as we know, it was French dealers in the 1790s who would have been the only people who could have bought then, given that the war had been declared with Britain. And so we have names appearing in some of the sale records showing the purchases of these goods. How they got through to the wider world is still something that, as with all revolutions and difficult times, is hard to pin down, and I'll show you some examples in a minute. But I just wanted to show you probably the most important, expensive, and celebrated work in the royal collections, this Riesner cabinet made for the Comtesse de Provence, and the sale catalogue description in 1835, when another figure who spent too much money, George Watson Taylor, a Jamaican sugar, we always call them sugar merchants. Now I think we have to realize they were selling slaves as well. But he had to sell the contents of his London and his country house. And he owned things like this, which was bought by George IV. So here are some ways in which we do know that furniture could have come into England. And when I say furniture, it is, of course, also porcelains. French porcelain was bought in huge quantities as well. So in 1802, the British could flock and did flock to Paris, and they went to the shop of dealers such as Eloy Lignereux, whose partner was in London. And although that picture is before the revolution, it gives us an idea of what it was like in the Palais Royal, buying all these wonderful French luxury objects. And it is fair to say, just to remember, that of course the English always had this long-standing admiration for French luxury goods. And during the 18th century, in the Ancien Régime, they had been buying in Paris and did buy in Paris. So Horace Walpole, Lord and Lady Spencer would travel to Paris and buy in the luxury shops in the Palais Royal. But what is different now is that they're selling old things. Before, it was always contemporary. This really coincides with a change in taste and collecting habits, starting to acquire old objects. The way in which they did arrive, and we know they arrived, was the sudden emergence of sales, 1815, 1816, 1819. And as you can see from this one here, you know, Parisian furniture, extensive and unique table and dessert service, objects from the ancient French court. This is how they were advertised and marketed. And I should just say that Mr. Phillips, who apparently worked with Mr. Christie and set off on his own, but he had connections with one of the most important dealers in France, Mailront. And their collaboration between the French and the English dealers, I don't think can be underestimated. So you will see in the next examples just the ways in which these works translated. So, and also the doubts we have about when. So one of the most famous armoires owned by William Beckford, possibly the one sold to him by the English dealer, Robert Fogg, a Chinaman and furniture dealer who again had links with Mailront among other French dealers. This wonderful cabinet, which again, as you can see, is one of a pair sold in 1813 for £400 and had been bought from the citizen doyen. I'm going to get neck crick trying to read my slides. So maybe it had been smuggled through the blockade. Again, tantalizing, but we don't know. Just to give you an idea of what the taste was, this beautiful commode with Pietrodora plaques, 17th century Pietrodora Florentine plaques. We know it was in a sale in 1795, so one of the revolutionary sales, and there it's sold to the dealer La Perry that you see, but it comes into England in 1825 only. And the Riesner commode, which has even more ambiguous history. We only know it was made in 1784, sold in 1794, and then it resurfaces in 1882. So with that ambiguity, all we can do is trace individual works. And as people look and explore and restore and investigate individual works, you can trace sometimes some of this complex history. So we have the dealers. We have the French and the English dealers collaborating, selling primarily in London to the collectors. But we also have the collectors going to Paris. So Byng, who was the son of an admiral and an MP, member of parliament, I'm going to come back to members of parliament, travelled to Paris and bought himself in Paris. So that coffer on stand, again by Boulle, is thought to have been bought in Paris from Madame Dubois. Whereas the magnificent cabinet on stand 1 of 2, now at Fitzwilliam, seems to have been acquired in England in the auction house in 1816. And I would say that, as one imagines, after the first quarter of the 19th century, increasingly the sales will be from in English auctions, English dealers, and the market will really sort of just be a recycling within Britain. But the beginning is very important, because when we look at why people were collecting and what they collected, it's that French knowledge, I think, that is important. But here, just to go back a step, are some examples of some of the sales taking place in the 1870s, 1880s, from Christie's, from, where else do we have? Oh, these all Christie's. Mr. Robbins, again, another important dealer. And the point that I want to come back to is just who were these people? Because I think it's one of the interesting things when we're looking at aristocratic collections is to think about that relationship within the aristocracy in Britain. So on the one hand, we see the rise of sales. You see that they are but from W.R. Innes Hopkins Esquire or Mr. King Esquire, not strictly speaking aristocrats. But when I asked a cataloguer in Christie's if I could call, I think it was either Innes Hopkins or Denison, middle class, he said, and it's so wonderfully English, I don't think the family would like it if you called them middle class. Many of them were MPs, but many of them also were younger sons who made money. And I think money probably is a factor all the way through. When the aristocrats had money, they bought Boulle and French furniture, and they sold it when they didn't. And when younger sons made money in railroads, or perhaps by being MPs, they bought French furniture. So as I say, we look at the market developing, and as we think about the market, one of the questions is perhaps how important was authenticity, how important was provenance, what are the sort of factors that the clients were looking for when these objects were coming onto the market at the beginning. And as we see from the entries, the catalogue entries are very unclear sometimes as to how authentic the object is. Here they do say from the Palace of Versailles, formerly in the possession of royalty. But when you look at the prices, which is tricky because not all catalogues are priced, you can't always say that something coming from Versailles is going to necessarily be more valuable, because here in another group of sales, there's at the bottom this pedestal-mounted black pedestals mounted with masks and borders. The pair fetches £375. No reference to Boulle, but the person in the sale room must have known that it was either very high quality, thought it was by Boulle, or certainly, at the very least, it was very grand. So we do have these problems of identification, and how far the original Boulle was more valuable is difficult to determine. But I think we have to assume that prices that went way above the normal, the person buying it thought he was buying something antique and original. And it's even more complicated with Riesner, because Riesner, the eboniste to Marie Antoinette, equally famous to Boulle, and the only two people who were recognized by their name. So everything is either Boulle or Riesner. In the case of Riesner, it's even more complicated because anything that sort of was Louis XVI or marquetry might be attributed to Riesner. So there's even less awareness of what Riesner meant than there was of Boulle. At least with Boulle, there was a long history of buying and selling Boulle furniture in France in the 18th century, which the British could draw on. So many years ago, and I attempted to do a kind of chart. As you can see, I only got to 1850, and this is where I have to go now, second half of the century. When I showed it to an economist, they said there are too many outliers to be valuable. So it's no good for an economist. But for us art historians, it shows that the original, what they thought was original, is almost always at the top end of the market. Obviously, where it's marked as Louis XIV is usually pretty good, but sometimes way down at the bottom. The disconcerting thing is that obviously things that are modern can also fetch quite high prices, and I'll show you why in a minute. So I'm not going to look at Riesner, but there's an example of just how complex it is to try and fathom exactly what you're looking at. At the same time, we get a very clear picture that what was old was valued quite considerably higher than what was, sort of just generic. And I think the other thing that's very interesting is that I think the prices remain the same during the 19th century. And they may go up and down, but they don't markedly go either one way or the other throughout the whole century. So, second point, translation. We've seen the transfer, we see the arise of a market. We're faced with the problems of a new market and the conditions behind new markets. But look what happened. Why did the English care so much about these works? But first, what did they do with them? So the first thing I thought about is a lot of those early collectors, and I'm showing you here one gallery of the enormous palace that was Fonthill Abbey, literally probably as big as a cathedral, built by William Beckford, who was the richest man in England in 1820. And there in this gallery, we have what is essentially a Gothic interior, but there are the torchères. See, I've done it wrong. There are the torchères. And there we see what he was putting in. So they were interspersing this French 18th century furniture into all of their rooms, although they may very well have had the saloon or drawing room in a more, quote, feminine, i.e. French mid-18th century curved Rococo style. One of the most important contributions to this style was the Elizabeth Saloon, created by the Duchess of Rutland at what is called Belvoir Castle, which was completely created in the 1820s by the architect Matthew Cotes Wyatt in really the two Les Louis style. Louis XIV for the ceiling, Louis XV for the side walls, and probably 15th and 16th for the furniture. Taken up by the Prince Regent when he became king, completely redecorated Windsor Palace into the very opulent, possibly even garish palace it is today. And here is the great drawing room at Windsor, where again Rococo vies with neoclassical, and a lot of it created new for the king, who wanted grand, sumptuous, rich furniture. As the style carries on, and here we just get one example from the middle of the century from the London townhouse of the Duke of Buccleuch. And here we again start to see the dealers at work. Walter Francis worked very closely with the dealer, Edward Holmes Baldock, and his accounts again list the furniture that he provided, and not only the furniture but also, of course, porcelains, both modern and old, looking after them, cleaning them, etc. Now, when they were buying, again, we're not sure that they knew what they were buying always. We're not sure the dealers always told them. Sometimes they knew. So, for example, George IV acquired that bull casket, new from an English furniture maker, and you notice the price of £210 for the I think just must be for the pair. Still, that's quite a lot, £110 each for the modern piece of furniture. Or the one on the right, which is a 19th century copy, very much imitating the original style, bought by the Marquis of Hertford and thought to be 17th century. So there is a sense again of authenticity, which probably later collectors were more aware of. And certainly one of the fascinating things is later collectors never minded having copies. And so here you get a copy of a Riesner made for, the wealthiest in the land. And in the room of, the Brook House of Lord Tweedmouth, again a banker and very rich Scottish figure with a house in London and a house in Scotland, he had copies as well of famous royal pieces, as did the Marquis of Hertford, as did they all. So there's a whole interesting thing about not minding having copies, because the representation of the old, of the royal, was as important as the fact that it was original, which totally contradicts what I've just said before about them valuing authenticity. So it's full of contradictions. However, I'll try and keep a few of them as possible. Examples of what the dealers like Baldock were doing could be very close imitations. There on the left you have essentially a copy of a mid-18th century piece of furniture very similar to that supplied to Madame de Pompadour by Urban, her famous French furniture maker. In this case, supplied by Edward Holmes Baldock. Equally to the Montagues and to the Buccleuchs, there at the top is a copy of a bureau plat at Bow Hill, or, very difficult, at the bottom we have an original 18th century piece, but they've embellished it by adding the porcelain plaques. And that is, again, I think, a point that is very important, this addition. So, Tina, this is for you. Here is the clock, which I found so fantastic at the Wallace. The clock is original, fantastic example of mid-18th century, designed by a designer who worked for Sèvres, as well as designing furniture, Duplessis. The base is absolutely fascinating because, first of all, it's put on a 19th century mount to make it bigger and bolder. Those mounts are taken from designs here and made again larger. And then the center part, it was plain, so they've embellished it with marquetry. It's not the American nouveau riche who invented the idea of bigger is better. The English were doing it in the 19th century as well. And anything that, as long as it was strong, bold, rich, was very much what the French style meant. And even to the point where these chairs made for the Lancaster House and owned by, again, if not the richest, but one of the richest men in Britain, George Granville Leveson Gower, who became Duke of Sutherland. It's awful. It's just a sort of debased form of 18th century art, but they were perfectly happy with it. In the 1830s, I do think that as the century went on, there became an increased interest in, having as authentic as possible. But authentic was important, but it also had to be sumptuous and grand. As the century progresses, the style becomes more and more generic. And I think this is where we start to move from translation to appropriation. These are pieces designed and made by Edward Holmes Baldock, which are not referencing any particular piece of furniture, but are simply in the Louis XV style. And it is at this point, when we're seeing objects which have very little to do with the original, that we can really talk about moving, if you like, from a translation of the original to the appropriation of it. And so here we come to the point I wrote about, is appropriation as a form of national style. And again, as we've seen, this is a complex issue. Everybody, I think quite rightly, you pointed out earlier that, everything is individual. So all of these people had different motives. We know that the style was taken up by people who were very conservative, who were liberal. Frederick Rothschild took up the Rococo style because he believed that the French 18th century was the best example of craftsmanship that you could get. And this will start to become perhaps the underlying motive in the collecting, which takes you from pure ostentation and wealth to something that is more commensurate with the reforming movements which were taking hold at the end of the 19th century. But I don't think we can deny ostentation and wealth. And I think we also have to see that much as aristocrats acquired and sold, who bought it? The great industrialists. And I cannot really see any difference in the forms of decoration between the house of the Grosvenors or the house of Lord Tweedmouth and banking, or between the industrial capitalists who were buying London houses in large quantities towards the end of the 19th century. The taste is very similar. But as I said, the idea of reform, that French furniture could act as a form of reform, is a different approach taken up by some. And here is where, as I say, Rothschild stresses that he was acquiring French furniture of the highest quality, and again he's aware of it as high quality, for the benefit of the nation, as an example of good, of beautiful work. And when we look at catalogue of somebody like the Countess of Blessington, who owned pieces of French furniture. I find it fascinating. She also was a great collector of mid-19th century Victorian painting, where skill and finish and perfection of models were extremely important. And I think this idea of skill and finish is something that could be admired in French furniture, and it challenged British collectors and suppliers to make furniture of the same quality. This slide got put out of place. It should have been earlier because I wanted to also just make the point that just as Rothschild was not at the time an aristocrat, he may have been very rich, but he wasn't an aristocrat, nor was Algernon Borthwick, although he was made ennobled. But I love the phrase, he's the friend and host of his sovereign, not because he owns the Daily Telegraph, but because he lives like a lord. And then to put us all art historians in our place, and possesses fine shooting. So the second person who was a great believer in the importance of French art as a model was the tailor, John Jones, who gave his collection to the Victoria and Albert Museum so that it could be an inspiration for craftsmanship. So we're back to skill and finish. Again, not an aristocrat, somebody with new money, who bought very fine things, but he also bought quite a lot of things which are now not on view in the V&A because they are not what they were meant to be. Canny dealers were selling him pastiches, which of course appealed to the 19th century eye, because again, this little secretaire is just a bit too much for the 18th century original. But he also did buy very fine pieces. And his motive was, again, creating a new form of style, an English form, which would rival French, but also benefit from the French taste. And so this idea that French style, French taste could be of interest, of benefit to the British permeates not just the aristocracy, but interestingly, it appears in manuals like this. So we start to see it become part of a handbook for the middle classes, trying to find whether the middle classes and how they engaged with this. Clearly, it was part of their furnishing style. And so we have it also in advertising of contemporary furniture makers like James Shoolbred as a sort of 19th century interior. Now, what led me to go deeper into this was this sentence, and then they were ushered into a drawing room of Parisian elegance, buhl cabinets, marquetry tables, hangings of the choicest damask, but also spoils of Venetian palaces. So the interior was not necessarily pure. It wasn't copying. In this idea of appropriation, we're starting to try and bring something that is English in the everyday, of elegance, of just the way in which you lived, particularly, of course, in the drawing rooms of London. But this painting by Tissot of the son of Selfridge's department store combines a French bureau plat with aesthetic furniture and this wonderful tiger skin, which of course gets pride of place. But it gets so the eclecticism keeps on, but it starts to become fused together into something that I think the English saw themselves as, if you like, part of a wider international world. Perhaps it's to do with colonialism and the idea of the British Empire, but they see themselves as part of an international world, if not even to go so far as to say a cosmopolitan world. And by cosmopolitan, they meant people who could be at home anywhere, who were able to absorb the best of many different countries. And Escott, T.H. Escott, in 1886, says British cosmopolitanism shows itself in its rapid assimilation of the social ideas of other countries and its heroic struggle to rise superior, we are talking about English, to the hampering restrictions of insular respectability. And later on, he says, I do not say that everyone goes to London now as all the world went to Paris once, but the British capital today approaches nearer to the Paris of 15 or 20 years ago than any other capital of the world. London is not the most beautiful, the most splendid, or even the most convenient city, but it is preeminently the smart metropolis of Europe. So it's this idea of being part of the wider world, the benefit of trade, of course, to Britain, the benefit of the colonies, that I think meant that when the rich and aristocratic collectors of 19th century Britain surrounded themselves with French furniture, they were rising beyond the nationalism of France. They were creating an international cosmopolitan style, drawing on the best, and to be honest, also some of the grandest and most opulent. So with that, we come to the end of the talk, but I just have one tiny postscript, because I did say that I would think also about the end of this. And that's something that I think we need to think about and work on again, because traditionally it's been said that at the end of the 19th century, because of things like agricultural harvests and the problems in the 1870s and 80s, the government trying to create corn laws and trying to alleviate some of the famines in Ireland, it dominates the 19th century. British aristocrats were faced with financial problems that they hadn't before, and they sold their collections. Well, they did, but they'd always been selling their collections. Anytime they went bankrupt or were in trouble, they sold their collections, either all of them or part of them. But the sale that sort of epitomizes this end of the 19th century transfer of power and money has always been said to be the sale of the Duke of Hamilton, when his coal mines fell and he didn't have money any longer. And so he created this huge sale of many days, and the important point for the future is that many of the buyers were American. And rightly or wrongly, and I think it is something that needs to be nuanced because many of the clients were also the English members of the English aristocracy and people like Rothschild who bought at the sale. The international market of dealers like Devine or René Gampel saw the opportunities to sell to the new money of America, and for the Americans, in the same way as the British had done in the early 19th century, they transfer the objects from the great English houses of French furniture, and they put them into their American houses and American collections. So Vanderbilt buys the Riesner Secretary you just seen, which is now at the Met. Frick, of course, the Frick collection, world famous for its collections of French art. Then we have Peter Widener, the great sausage and pork manufacturing tycoon who was a client of Devine's, and the famous Mrs. Huntingdon, who could also put together vast collections in New York and California, a wealth that the British hadn't seen since possibly 1820. Thank you very much. Not too bad.